Hello everyone. So nice to be here. So nice to be here again. I've been a quite frequent visitor of HAISA over the past year, and my first HAISA and actually my first scientific conference was here in this very room in 2015. So I've been looking very much forward to getting back for the past 3 years, but someone made that troublesome by releasing some kind of pandemic, which I personally think was a bit of an overreaction. But anyway, here we are, and I'm going to present my paper, Survey on Users' Willingness to Adopt and Pay for Cybersecurity Training, which is a piece of research that I've done together with Markus Nolberg, sitting right there, and Martin Gellestedt and Jonna Rambusch, who have to be left in Sweden this time. So there is an agenda which conforms to any other agenda that you will see during this conference. But to give you a little bit of an introduction to the research problem, I'm not going to elaborate on why human behavior in the cybersecurity domain is important. I guess that's widely acknowledged, at least in this room. But just to set the stage a little bit, users face threats on a daily basis, and the common suggestion for how to manage or mitigate those threats remains training. So we're telling users, organizations to apply training, and then things will eventually be good. If you look at the research base surrounding cybersecurity training or actions to improve cybersecurity behavior, it typically assumes that such training is provided by an organization. Or that the user that is trained or gets increased knowledge or is subjected to policies or whatever is part of an organizational setting. But when we look at users in their private capacity, those users are expected to cater for their security needs on their own, and this includes a large part of the population, not least young ones, but the elderly, people not working in organizations for various reasons, or people not working for organizations that follow our recommendations, organizations that are not providing any cybersecurity training. And the aim of this research is to address cybersecurity training for users in their private capacity. So a little bit of background. What we aim to do in this research is to measure private users' willingness to pay and willingness to adopt cybersecurity training. And the rationale for looking at willingness to pay is when users have to acquire training in their own capacity, they either have to be given it for free, which can be troublesome because it means that someone else will have to pay for it on their behalf, or they will have to pay for it on their own. So willingness to pay is if a person is willing to spend money, and if so, how much. And we're also measuring willingness to adopt, which is how likely the user is to adopt something. And we have tried to group together and categorize approaches to cybersecurity training in 3 main groups, and we'll measure willingness to adopt and pay for those categories of training. And what we're focusing on is e-learning platforms that users access on demand, or where material is broadcasted in some way at regular intervals, such as non-learning options that come to your inbox regularly and that you may or may not open. Game-based training, where game mechanics are used for teaching, and this is quite a broad category that would include competitive games, single-player games, story-based quizzes, so on and so forth. And also contextual training, where users are provided with training when they encounter a situation that will pose an elevated cybersecurity risk, or experience such situations as part of some kind of simulation. So the research questions that we are working with here is, first, to what extent are private users willing to adopt the different types of cybersecurity training? And the rationale for having this question is that it becomes hypothetical, because we're asking users to adopt something that they don't know about. But on the other hand, when you make a decision to buy something, it's sort of the same situation, because you are adopting something that you don't really know 100% about yet. And if we can see that the hypothetical willingness to adopt something is great, then of course the chance of you actually going for that option will also be greater. The second research question, to what extent are private users willing to pay for the different types of cybersecurity training? And finally, we also wanted to investigate if worry about cyber threats will impact the user's willingness to adopt or pay for cybersecurity training. So the method at a glance, we did an online survey using a web panel that is called WebRecall. I think it's quite common to Qualtrics that I know is quite frequently used. It's a web panel of quite a lot of Swedish members. We gathered responses from 1,437 Swedish participants. We used a stratified sampling approach within this web panel, where the panel is separated into subgroups based on gender, age, and place of living. And then we use the simple random sampling within each subgroup. And the intention here is to get a sample that is truly representative of Swedish users, or at least Swedish users that happen to be a member of this web panel, which is basically as good as we can get it. And then we did statistical analysis with ANOVA and correlation tests. And I'm not going to go into too big details on the map. If you want to hear more about that, you can call or email Martin Gelles, that he's our statistics professor. So real quickly, the survey design, we had one quick block with some demographic question. Then we had a second block with the willingness to pay and willingness to adopt questions. And in this block, participants were presented with a description of the training type. Then they were asked to complete the willingness to pay and willingness to adopt questions, where the willingness to adopt was a Likert scale that I will show shortly, and the willingness to pay was a more frank question. Will you pay for this or not? You shouldn't walk too far back on the stage. And then we repeated this for all three training types. And we had a third block of query question, which was also a Likert scale construct. Then for data analysis, when we analyzed the scales, we computed an index as the mean of all response values. So there were a number of items in each scale. The mean response value became an index that we used as the main metric in the analysis in this case, which does create sort of an overview analysis where we didn't really go super deep into the data, which we could have done looking at the individual items. But on the other hand, someone enforced the 10-page limit for this conference. So there is not an unlimited amount of space for tables. We used Chromebox Alpha to measure the scale consistency as per standard. So now let the number fest commence. And those of you who do not like to look at numbers and p-values and stuff, you can fall asleep for roughly 8 minutes. And then I have 2 summarizing slides that will tell you what the numbers actually mean. So when we looked first on willingness to adopt, we had 5 different items where the participant responded on a 5-item scale on how well they agreed with the statement. And this was after reading a description of a training type. I'm not going to go through them all. I'm going to skip forward to the index value, which is the mean of everything above, also a little bit bigger, so that you should also focus there. And here we see that the willingness to adopt index is highest for contextual training, then comes e-learning, then comes game-based training. We also did a measure of the proportions of users that had an index value of at least 4. And the idea of that is that 4 or 5, we consider those to be sort of accepting answers. So if you answered 4 or 5, you felt that this training type was something that you would most likely try, or you would be kind of positive towards the statement. And that kind of reinforced the numerical responses, with 62% being positive towards textual training, 39% for e-learning, and 27% for game-based. I will get back to this if I have time, but I really think that it's interesting looking at all the research that goes into how game elements should be used for increasing user adoption and user satisfaction, and we see those numbers. Something that we didn't have space for in this analysis was to look at free text answers provided by our respondents. And there it was quite obvious that a large part of the adult population, their responses can be summarized as, we don't do games. And I think two conclusions can be drawn from that. Now I'm sidetracking a little bit. One is that in elder populations, a lot of people don't want games. So the question is, do they not want to play games, or do they think that they don't want to play games? Because I'm not sure that, I'm not really sure if we would have those low numbers if we subjected people to actual training of the three types and asked them what they thought about it. But that's something for future work. Actually, both the analysis and the follow-up is part of future work. Moving on to confirming those results. So we did an ANOVA to see if this identified tendency was statistically significant. Given the large sample size and the quite large differences in respondent, it's no surprise that it was. And postdoc tests also showed that willingness to adopt was highest for contextual, followed by e-learning, followed by game-based. And there is a 95% confidence interval of the difference here to highlight that it was actually kind of a big difference between the different training types, with roughly 1.25 steps between context-based or contextual and game-based, which was the biggest difference. So for willingness to pay, we asked if the participants wanted to pay or not, and if they wanted to pay, we asked them how much they wanted to pay. And this is quite interesting. So the results are roughly the same, with the most positive answers for contextual training. But I also think it's interesting to point out that only 30% of the participants in the most positive group wanted to or would consider paying for cybersecurity training. But when we asked them what they wanted to pay, they were actually willing to spend quite a bit, around 500 Swedish kroner, which is roughly 50 euro, which I think is quite a lot. Of course, this metric should be taken with a grain of salt, because you see in this kind of research, it's quite frequently discussed that willingness to pay values are higher than they would be in reality. But it still shows that there is quite a good willingness to pay for those that are actually willing to pay. And we then also took a mean maximum price over all participants, where we treated those that were unwilling to pay as 0, which becomes sort of a silly exercise, because given the percentages here, of course, contextual training is much higher than the other ones. So looking at the relationship between those numbers and worry, we calculated a worry index based on 5 different items, and the mean value was 3.3. It doesn't really matter. We were more interested in the worry value for each individual participant, so that we could correlate that to the willingness to adopt cybersecurity training. Quite surprisingly, though, when we calculated the correlation number, by the way, for those that don't speak statistics, is a number between 1 and -1, where the edges, 1 or -1, signify a strong correlation, and the closer you get to 0, the weaker the correlation is. And all of our correlations, while positive, meaning some kind of correlation positive between willingness to pay or adopt for cybersecurity training and your level of worry, all correlations were weak. Typically, correlations below 0.29 are considered very weak, by some argued to be meaningless. And well, applying that to those numbers, they are all meaningless. So it's very nice to be here reporting them to you. For those of you who fell asleep, you can now wake up so I can tell you the meaning of the numbers. If we look at willingness to adopt, there are people telling me that I should stand more still when I'm speaking to people, and I guess they are correct. So talking about willingness to adopt, it's clear in those results that contextual training is getting higher results than e-learning, which in turn gets higher results than game-based. 70% are positive to at least one training type, and I think that is quite positive in a hypothetical scenario. People do demonstrate willingness to have cybersecurity training, but we can always take the negative approach and say that 30% are not interested, but let's not go there today. When we look at willingness to pay, I would say that the main outcome of that exercise is that it confirms the willingness to adopt results. I'm not sure if there is a point in putting too much value on the actual numbers, but with clever business models, I would still argue that since participants are reporting willingness to pay up to 50 euros, even if we cut that down to 10 euros or even to 5 euros with clever business models, there is a way to make money selling cybersecurity training to the private market. And why I think that is good is because there is a lack of training efforts geared towards the private market. And of course, if someone should develop that, must be a market interest, because if someone can't make money, they're less likely to do it. And the correlations, as I said, between worry and willingness to adopt and pay is positive, but weak to the level of being meaningless. Some implications is that training is most likely, contextual training is the method that is most likely to be adopted by users. This research, of course, doesn't say anything about how they will perceive it when they actually use it, but in the stage where they are deciding to adopt or not, it's likely that the chance of someone starting to use contextual training is higher. Also, a rather large proportion, 30% of the users, show a low interest in adopting any training. And I think that something that's an implication of that is that training can't solve all of the big behavior problems that we are encountering. And based on this and quite a lot of other research, I think there is an overbelief in what training can achieve when it comes to cybersecurity training. And willingness to pay is low all over, with only 30%, as I said, being willing to pay for contextual training, which was the highest value. So for some future work, this is a study that is conducted in Sweden with all the limitations that comes with doing something within a single population. So replication to other populations would be an obvious future work. I think that we were quite surprised by seeing that worry did not impact willingness to pay or adopt, and we really looked for it. We did much more statistical tests than I can explain here, but we didn't find any strong correlations or even any medium correlations. This can, of course, be due to an ill-applied research method, and I'm open for that possibility. But I do think that the results calls for qualitative research geared at understanding the underlying factors behind willingness to adopt and pay for cybersecurity training. Perhaps especially adoption, because we really need to understand how to make users want to learn more about security. And it's, of course, easy to say in this setting where I suppose most agree about the importance of this topic, but a little bit harder in other settings. With the data set that we have, I think that we can also quantify the impact on willingness to adopt specifically, perhaps also willingness to pay on different variables using regression analysis. That's something that we haven't done yet, but that could be done with this data set. And related to that, the data set will be published sooner or later, and anyone that wants to is free to explore it and use it, which is the big benefit of open data. I also want to point out that anyone is free to adopt and develop our constructs if it can help in your research. And if you want to cooperate in cybersecurity training and usable security, I'm easily found in the hotel bar, on LinkedIn, or via email. And with that said,